So this workshop is called Care Web's Broadening Our Capacities as IBPOC artists and art workers. This will be a 1-hour brainstorming session that will attempt to be a collective creative investigation of how artists can thread our own care webs with each other and the role we want community, local, national arts organizations, and funders to play to help us facilitate and sustain our care needs in our personal and our career lives. We will come together to consolidate our stories, past and present, ideas, future, about care in the art sector. And we'll look at a couple of IBPOC writers on care. We'll refer to their labor that they already did, and we'll use their labor to understand care, the history of care webs as a survival strategy, and our own capacities to give and receive care. And then we'll gather in small groups for conversations. And then we'll finally regroup to kind of summarize what we talked about in our groups. And all of this, I'm hoping that our conversations can be consolidated, whether you're live or whether you're live in person or you're live from online. And then I'm hoping that it can be consolidated and kind of we can create a neat package of what we talked about in this workshop. And this will be an effort to kind of continue this care webbing system that we can kind of take our findings, our conversations from today and use it as a resource for future applications or future thinking or your projects. And because we're all here, we're all going to be contributing to this this written document, then I believe that it should be okay for all of us to to refer back to it. And when the next time you're applying for funding, if you need to refer to what we talked about, that should be okay. So I would like to just kind of put that out there, and just that, like, if you're participating in this workshop, your consent in your thoughts and words potentially being made into a document that will be shared with everybody else in this virtual and in physical space, is your consent is kind of assumed by your participation. Cool. And let me know if you have any questions in the chat. As a facilitator, I prefer when questions are I invite my participants to ask questions as they come, not to wait till the end, so that we can have a more active learning process. I'm just gonna, before I begin the care webs, I'm just gonna begin by positioning myself. My name is Khadija. I'm an immigrant, and I acknowledge that I'm located on unceded indigenous lands of Tiohtià:ke Miniang, which is Montreal. So I'm currently in Montreal, but I'm Toronto-based. The Kanien'kehá:ka people of the Flint Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters. These places are and will continue to be home to Indigenous peoples. By acknowledging the traditional territories that I'm engaged in my daily life, I commit to reflect on my personal relationships with Indigenous international relations, which include humans, animals, plants, earth, water, and air. By acknowledging the land on which I reside, I commit to seek out the history and teachings of the natural world. By acknowledging the treaties that were signed by Indigenous peoples through which I benefit from as a settler immigrant, I commit to explore my rights and responsibilities to Indigenous international relations and Black people who were violently and forcefully displaced into this country for the benefit of early settlers that extended further violence to Indigenous peoples. Following the teachings of Dish with One Spoon and the two-row wampum belt, originally between the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people, I commit to, as a textile artist, only collect, harvest, forage what I need from the land, waters, and skies, and leave enough for others and for the lands, waters, and skies to continue to live and thrive. And I commit to educate myself about my responsibilities as a settler, guest, immigrant, and commit to learning the local protocols on whose territories I am in, so I may contribute to a respectful relationship between myself and people and the land. I'm going to share my screen now. So this is our agenda for today. We'll begin with free write. I'll explain what that is later, and we'll talk about care webs, and then we'll have a jam session, which is going to be group conversations, and then we'll regroup for the consolidation of the data. So free write. Now, this is my invitation for you to position yourself. Like I just position myself in relationship to my land, to where I am currently sitting. So this is an invitation for you to position yourself and kind of have a self check-in. So I would like folks to, if you're in person or whether you're online, to write whatever comes to your mind in relation to these questions. And if you don't have access to writing tools or paper, you may just kind of text on to yourself, like type on your phone, or just kind of reflect on it quietly. So to help us with that, we're going to ask ourselves our current capacities and vulnerabilities. What knowledge, resources, and support are you able to offer in this workshop? Recognize your position in the room. What privileges do you have right now? And what baggage are you bringing in with you? So this is a this is a 1 hour workshop. So we are going to be talking in groups, and perhaps, you may be talking, you may be kind of like responding on behalf of your group, or you may not. So the idea of this is just to kind of like recognize where you are right now, and recognize that maybe today I'm feeling very chatty, so I'm going to maybe take up a lot of space, and then recognizing that if we're feeling super chatty and super comfortable and excited, then we might want to be aware that other people who are not feeling super energetic, we still want to invite them to share their thoughts and feelings. Cool. So I'm going to put the timer on for 3 minutes, and we'll just position ourselves. And this is free write, so you can write it in any way you want. You can write it in paragraph, jot notes, you can doodle, or you can just think to yourself. And I'll just put a timer for 3 minutes right now. Go. And that was time. So I hope that you were able to reflect on how you're feeling and how you might be able to contribute and benefit from this workshop. I will speak about my position right now. My position, I'm at a place of privilege because I am the facilitator. So I'm like technically given more time and space to talk. I'm doing talking more. And my capacity right now is to talk about care and to talk about care webs and to talk about this topic and kind of assume the role of leadership and facilitating you folks to have these conversations. And I'll start over. Care webs are unpaid labor for and often by the people in the same community whose needs are not being met by the state or institution. Care webs are how many of our ancestors survived colonialism and post-colonialism. And technically we're still in colonialism because we're still in a colony. And it is also, care webs is also how BIPOC, 2S LGBTQ+, immigrants, refugees, and other marginalized communities continue to survive today in late stage capitalism, poverty, surveillance, environmental racism, sexism, homophobia, Islamophobia, and all the isms and phobias. So for example, during the pandemic, mutual aid, for example, is an example of care web. So during the pandemic, a lot of artists lost contracts. We lost our opportunities to have exhibitions and get paid for it, or our teaching jobs kind of got canceled because of like the beginning of the pandemic, and there were a lot of problems or like challenges with accessing government relief funding because like artists have a different income situation going on. So a form of mutual aid was that, for example, one arts organization created an Excel sheet that had a list of things that people needed on one side, and then on the other side, people could kind of write down their names and contact information that, okay, I can do this for you, or I can, pick up these supplies for you. I can help you with this application. And then other forms of mutual aid is kind of similar, where, for example, in the community that I grew up in Toronto, I grew up in a Toronto community that was underprivileged, and a form of care web or a form of mutual aid is that people, or like a lot of women, took turns babysitting each other's kids. you know, a lot of them were working shift jobs, so they took turns babysitting each other's kids. They took turns picking up their children from school, and all of this is because the state or the institution or, you know, the city of Toronto or the government of Ontario and Canada did not provide enough care and resources to like certain populations so that they could do what they needed to do. So that's when communities kind of gather together and make up their own like support systems. So this workshop, we'll go to a jam session. Oh, no. Okay. So this is going to be our jam session where I will invite you folks. I'll share a link on chat. And for folks who are in person, you can gather around and kind of go over these questions yourselves in conversation with each other. And then I will ask maybe Kevin to take notes of what's being said in the in-person workshops. And so first, we're going to begin with what are some ways our families and or communities have created a care web for each other to survive before, during, and after the COVID lockdown period. And this slide is meant to be like everybody can kind of pitch in their responses. And then these are color coded. Each color has the same questions, but in different slides. And over here, we'll kind of gather in groups and answer the question in these 3 slides. So the first slide is asking who is in your care web? Who supports your art practice and who supports your supporters? So who do you give care for? Sorry, who do you give care and who gives you care? And this can be as personal and as professional as you want, although I do feel like as artists, our professional and personal lives are intermingled. And who supports our supporters, right? And who supports us as caregivers? Because if we're caregivers, who's giving us care, or who's recognizing that? And what resources are available but inaccessible for our caregivers, care receivers, and or IBPOC artists and art workers? And I guess on that note, how can arts organizations and funders make it more accessible? So like, for example, how can it be more accessible for us to receive funding for this festival so that we don't have tech problems, right? As we were saying before. And then the last slide is, what does the art sector not realize about our struggles as marginalized creators? How can the art sector make space to include IBPOC artists and art workers and their care webs? So on this note, I want to talk about, for example, I was in my family comes to art shows and galleries if I'm exhibiting in it, but they wouldn't kind of like go on their own to a museum. And my family is like a newcomer immigrant family. So like my parents, my grandma they've come to a lot of my shows. And I was giving my grandma a tour of an exhibition at the Textile Museum of Canada. I was giving her a tour in Urdu and she was super engaged and she was like, asking a lot of questions about this exhibition, the history, the makers. And then I realized that, my grandma wouldn't go to a tour given by the museum on her own. And I just realized that why aren't museums and galleries providing tours or other workshops in languages other than English and French, especially if galleries are, especially when galleries are exhibiting work by IBPOC artists. We should be having, more resources for IBPOC communities to be in those spaces, and maybe like have after hour tours or after hour like exclusive IBPOC community kind of orientations. Yeah, so those are my thoughts. And so we'll just kind of talk about it in groups. And for those of us on Zoom, I'll share this slide. I'll share this. And we can just all contribute to it. Yeah. And I don't know if there's like a mic available in the in-person section, but I would love to hear everybody's thoughts. And are there any questions? Okay, so I will, I guess, go back on the jam session. Okay, yes, we have a mic. Awesome. So I'll go back to jam session. So this is the first question. Oops. This is the first question that we're thinking about with each other. What are some ways our families and our communities have created a care web for each other to survive? This can be before the pandemic lockdowns, during or after, or yeah. So, and it doesn't have to be specifically related to the pandemic or the lockdown. So we'll talk about that. And so we have about, how much time do we have left? I believe we have about 35 minutes. Okay, 30 minutes, perfect. So maybe I'll time it for 15 minutes for this group activity. Okay. And then for the next 15 minutes, I would like to open it up to everybody else. I've just changed the slide for next questions, and this is for, again, for group conversation. Who is in your care web? Who supports your art practice? And who supports your supporters? It's so much fun to see the text happening. It's like I can kind of see a process of thought. I see that our writers on Zoom have kind of paused typing when on question number 3, and I think it is a little difficult to think about who supports our supporters. What is their support system? I'm going to switch to the next slide. You can keep typing or talking about the previous questions. What resources are available but inaccessible for our caregivers, care receivers, and or IBPOC artists and art workers? And I guess on that note, what should the resource holders and I just added a question, what should these resource holders do to make them more accessible? So a lot of times we say, like when we talk about what can organizations do to support us better, a lot of us talk about like funding, right? Like allocate more funding to us or to our like IBPOC organizations. But maybe we can kind of think about what that could look like. You know, is it like funding that kind of directly comes into our pockets, or funding that hires more by like IBPOC administrators who will read our applications, right? Because like as IBPOC artists, it is sometimes I don't know about you, but sometimes I might feel like if I am writing an application or for an exhibition proposal, and the jury might be mostly white, and I have to explain my idea and my background from A to Z. But if there's funding allocated to specifically hire IBPOC jury members, then I can kind of talk about my idea or the history of, my art practice, my culture from like the middle. I don't have to justify or explain everything to the reader in my application. So let's kind of think about where should the funding go and how should it be allocated. Ooh, jury education. I like that. Like jury education, jury training. Yeah, like more anti-O training, perhaps to all IBPOC, well, to all funders and the institutions. I'm just going to, it's okay. I don't want to stop this juicy conversation and typing, so we'll have some more time for the next slide. Okay, I'll move on to the next slide for the next 5-ish minutes, because we have 15 minutes left, or less than 15 minutes left. So now we're talking about what does the art sector not realize about our struggles as marginalized creators, and how can the art sector make space to include IBPOC artists and art workers and their care webs? Sometimes, for example, for my own reflection, for the first question, as an IBPOC artist, I find that a lot of times the funding or the resources for IBPOC artists is like specifically for IBPOC artists to make work about being IBPOC, or to make work about our culture, our like personal history or our autobiography, and so it kind of removes the opportunity for us to explore art in ways other than our our identity. It's kind of like, because we're IBPOC artists, we have to justify our art practice and make it about our experience as IBPOC artists, not just as artists. That's what I find. In about 2 minutes, we'll gather or we'll regroup to talk about our findings. But because we are reading and we're able to read the virtual folks' words, I would like to hear what people in the theater have been talking about. So in the meantime, can we arrange for a microphone to be passed along? Okay, great. Thank you so much. I'll just leave all of the slides here, but yeah, please, Kevin, help me facilitate this part. What have you folks been talking about, and which question kind of got the more juicy conversations going?
Wow, I think all of them. I think the questions are rich and beautiful and nuanced and also complicated. So we're talking a lot about first one around the one around COVID and pre-COVID, what happened. It's this idea of like cooking and being together and grocery shopping happened during COVID, but it was also calling and WhatsApping and checking in that happened, and that some of the ways in which we think there was impact on like family gatherings because it didn't happen the same way. And so when you reach to the next one around your care webs, is that your care webs are actually impacted by COVID in itself. But we realize that we're also many persons within our care webs, from family and friends and colleagues in the arts to maybe peers at work, and that they also, through question number 2, they support many things. Our practices are supported by parents or siblings or friends. The funding bodies, the larger community organizations, but also the larger communities and then also mentors that are really important to supporting our artistic practice. An interesting part of the last question, who supports your supporters, was philanthropy. We brought up this conversation around philanthropy and how philanthropy supports the arts, and maybe philanthropy through donations and donorships also support large organizations or organizations that we work with. I miss anything so far? And in the last set of questions, I think a lot of our conversation was surrounded like understanding conflict with funding bodies and the ways in which we write or communicate our work, and the ways in which we also may engage with organizations. So there's expectations based on the ways in which we should communicate, the ways we should apply and speak about our work as based in a Eurocentric, possibly a Eurocentric way. And if we don't work in that, or create in those particular ways, and what are some of the things that we need to think about in that relationship? Alida brought up the conversation around, support and in like conflict resolution in the creation process. And what does it mean as IBPOC artists to actually have information and support within that structure? Which is a really beautiful and interesting one, because we want to move our artistic work forward. But it can actually not benefit the process if there's huge conflict resolution in the creative process. And I wrote one around, we're already under-resourced working as artists of IBPOC artists, and so that actually implicates our creative works. I was part of a tour at the Moving Inspiration Dance Festival in Winnipeg earlier in November, and H.P. Patton is a professor from the UK that was there, and he was talking about, because we've been under-resourced and not been given the funding support for such a longer part of the history of working in the West, that we end up having to train when the money is not for training, it's for actually creation. And so that actually impacts the ways in which our work arrives in spaces, on stage, during the creation process. It may impact the conflicts, that because we're communicating in languages that is not necessarily our own, number one, because we're also then perpetuating, as you mentioned, sort of the colonized structures of communicating about work, sometimes putting that same value on creators that we're working with that may actually think differently about work. So I wanted to mention that as well, because I think that's part of the under-resourcing that we see, is that we're focusing on training artists because they may also not have the same amount of breadth of training as ourselves as creators, but we want to get the work out there, and so we spend a lot of time doing that, which is instead of creating the work or having the time to create the work. Did I miss anything?
Cool. Thank you so much, Kevin, for summarizing that. I believe there was somebody else from on Zoom who was participating. I would like to invite you to unmute yourself and talk about your experience responding to these questions, if you would like. If not, it's totally okay. Okay, cool. Thank you. So I guess the next step is for me to kind of go back to my slides and your responses and kind of, consolidate them and make them look, not that your words are not pretty, but, make them look, organize them or kind of categorize them. And then, and I hope that Kevin and the AV team can help me figure out who was present, maybe like, take on the names and email addresses, and then, or I'll just share the final document with Kevin, and then who pass it around to the rest of the participants who participated. And if there's any feedback of like how this workshop went, I would appreciate that, because again, this is my first workshop on broadening our capacities, this like group activity. So if you have any feedback for me, that would also be appreciated. And I believe we have like 2 minutes left. Yes, I will place my email here. You are welcome to email me if you would like to kind of chat or expand on that. Okay, thank you so much for having me. in this festival and conference. And thank you so much, Kevin, and the AV team and all of you participants for engaging with this. And I'm really excited to see where it can go.